Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for your ongoing support of our live streams, which we are providing free as a public service. If you're enjoying these free live streams and would like to join the effort to keep them going, we've just launched a new platform that makes giving easier than ever. Please stay tuned at the end of this program for details on how you can pledge your support. We have a terrific lineup of programs in the fall, and coming up, we have an election series that we'll be announcing soon that I think you'll be excited about. We also have special member-only programs where members can interact directly with the speakers. So if that's of interest to you, please go to our website at lawac.org to see how you can become a member today. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan's three topics today are Congress and COVID-19, why partisanship is stronger than the pandemic. Number two, what is a learning pod? How will it change public education while public schools are shut down? And the morning headlines, never a dull moment there, news from the front page. For those of you who are new to Dan's programs, we'll be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's show, and she'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Dan, I can't wait for today's discussion. It's time for me to turn it over to you. Take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. And as is the case most weeks, there's no shortage of topics for us to discuss under the broader umbrella of politics in the time of coronavirus. And as I'll try to do each week is I'll lay out at least a few that were of particular interest to me this week, and then sooner rather than later, open up the conversation to address the topics that all of you, our participants and our audience members, would like to address. So as Kim mentioned, the big news in Washington this week is the ongoing debate over the latest round, what would be the fifth COVID relief bill to pass Congress since the pandemic reached our shores earlier this year. It seems like it was only 4 months ago that the COVID-19 virus was an emergency that required the nation's political leaders to put aside their partisan differences. And in fact, for the most part, that's what they did, passing not one, not two, but 4 different relief packages, gradually ascending in size and scope over the course of those months. But that bipartisanship that existed for those first few rounds of legislative action, well, that appears to be pretty much gone. Of course, the coronavirus is still an emergency. Most of you may have probably seen the news this morning that shows that the US economy contracted in the second fiscal quarter by 32.9%, by almost 1/3 on an annual basis. And that's by far the worst quarter economically this country has seen since the Great Depression. But in Washington, as Kim mentioned, it appears that partisanship is more powerful than the pandemic. Tomorrow's July 31st, and that is the last day before unemployment benefits will run out for millions of Americans who've lost their jobs as a result of the virus. This deadline is no surprise, of course. It's been on the calendar for months. And when Congress went on their recess right before the 4th of July holiday, they made the case at that point that having the last 2 weeks of July would give them more than enough time to come to agreement on new COVID relief legislation, not just an unemployment benefits extension, but a broader package as well. Well, here we sit, a little bit less than 36 hours before the deadline, and that package is looking decidedly less likely, according to public statements from both Democratic congressional leaders and from the White House. Before I go on, and we can talk about what's holding up the package and what its the prospects for passage are, let's take a moment to get your assessment on the prospects for a COVID-19 relief bill passing. So Claire, if we can put up our first our question for the audience. The question is, when do you think Congress will pass a COVID-19 relief package? And our options, as you can see, is option 1 by tomorrow night, the deadline that has existed for some time now. Number 2 by the end of next week, so a little bit late, but not that bad. 3rd by the end of August, so keeping Congress in session, even when they'd rather be out campaigning for re-election, but getting it done before Labor Day. Or 4th and finally, that they won't get a package done before the election. So let's see how optimistic or pessimistic all of you are, how much confidence you have in our United States Congress. 10% are very optimistic. 10% believe that by tomorrow night, we'll see a package pass. And the Republican congressional leadership made it clear just this morning that they were willing to pass an unemployment benefits only package, a so-called skinny relief package right now, come back for a broader piece of legislative package later. We'll see if that happens. 47%, almost half of you said by the end of next week. In other words, Congress will blow its deadline, but not too badly. And while that will cause extraordinary pain and discomfort for millions of unemployed Americans, about half of you think that within a week they'll have this back on track, at least this aspect. 38% are a little bit more skeptical. I think it's going to take until the end of August, a full month after the benefits expired, in order to move forward. And 4% are profoundly pessimistic that there will not be another COVID relief package before the election. So interesting spread, and I'll be more eager to hear more of your thoughts on this as we go forward. So as I said, right now, negotiators on both sides are saying that finishing by tomorrow is very unrealistic. And it looks more and more likely that Congress will stay in session, whether it's for a week or a month based on your predictions, because they know this is the last chance they'll have to pass a COVID relief bill before the election. And the last thing that members of Congress of either party want to do is go back to their home states and districts without having passed additional relief for those in need. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Republicans have floated the idea of just passing an extension of the unemployment benefits immediately and then moving on to the tougher issues in August. The challenge there is that the Democrats know that the unemployment benefits are their greatest pressure point on the Republicans. That's their best bargaining chip. And they're in a much better position to get the money that they're asking for schools and for state and local governments and for their other priorities, if this is all done at once, if the unemployment benefits are separated out, and some of the urgency goes away. And to be fair to the Democrats, it is worth noting that they passed their version of the relief bill way back in May, and they've been waiting for Republicans ever since. So both sides will be pointing fingers at the other for being recalcitrant, and both are probably right. So the question I want to address, though, before we move on to our next issue, is why is this so complicated? This is a national emergency. Why is it so difficult for our elected leaders to come together the way they have a number of times over the course of the last several months? And I'd suggest to you that the biggest obstacle that they're facing right now is because instead of having two sides who are trying to negotiate, there are actually four different sides, four different negotiating camps, maybe five. So let's take a minute and go through these different factions, and we'll get a better sense of why it's such a complicated, difficult process back in Washington right now. Group number one, of course, are the Democrats, and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and what appears to be a party united behind them. Their bill, the one they passed in May, calls for a $3 trillion package of relief with a continuation of the current $600 weekly unemployment benefits. And as I said a moment ago, that includes more money for state and for local government, for schools, for money for elections, a number of other things. The second group, obviously, is the Republican leadership. Mitch McConnell and his lieutenants, sort of Kevin McCarthy and the House Republican leadership, they want not a $3 trillion, but a $1 trillion overall relief package with less for unemployment benefits. They're talking about roughly $200 a week rather than $600, in addition to what the states are spending. And they're also calling for spending in other areas, but less than the Democrats. And they also, as we've talked about previously, they want legal protections for businesses, for schools, and for healthcare providers from lawsuits related to the virus. Both sides want more money for small business, another round of direct stimulus payments to individuals and families, probably another $1,200 a month. So those are two groups, but there's more. Let's keep going. The third group, along with the Democrats and the Republican leadership, is you have a growing number of conservative Republicans, primarily in the Senate, but in the House as well, who think that a $1 trillion package that McConnell has proposed is too big too. And they want a much smaller relief package. They believe that the previous spending has been almost sufficient and that continuing to run up the deficit is something that they're not comfortable with. Now, this faction is now expanded, may represent roughly half of the Senate Republican caucus. And the great irony is the more conservative Republicans who vote against a COVID-19 package, the more McConnell will have to rely on Democratic votes for passage, which means ultimately the legislative relief effort will end up costing more rather than less. Fourth, you have the White House and the president. They support McConnell on the legal protections, but it appears that the president wants to spend much more than $1 trillion on this package than most Republicans do. And the ultimate number that he supports will be much closer to the Democratic overall figure of $3 trillion. Trump has also called for a payroll tax cuts, which has been dismissed by leaders of both parties. And he's now advocating for money for a new FBI building that neither Democrats or Republicans in Congress want also. So one more complication. And then last but not least, you have a group of more progressive Democrats. And they're keeping pretty quiet now. They are staying unified behind Pelosi and Schumer. But as a deal gets closer, you're going to see some of those more committed progressives talking loudly, urging Schumer and Pelosi to oppose the legal protections that the Republican wants and to increase the overall size of the relief package even further. So let's call that 4.5 factions, none of whom appear in any hurry to compromise. But in the meantime, let's shift the conversation from Washington to how the virus is affecting the rest of us. And as you may remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about the difficult question of how and whether schools would reopen. Well, the resurgence of the virus over the last several weeks has answered that question for us. Most schools will not be reopening in person, at least not anytime soon. Here in California, roughly 80% of the state's public schools will start the fall online, and the numbers around the country are not much different than that. Now, what's happened over the weeks, as it's become more and more clear that most schools will be opening online, is we're seeing groups all over the country. We're seeing groups of concerned parents who are banding together to provide what they believe would be a superior educational alternative to ongoing online learning. And the term that's being used for their alternative is a learning pod. Now, what's a learning pod? A learning pod is a small group of parents who team up to hire a private instructor, either a fully credentialed teacher or a tutor, as a way to secure childcare for their younger kids and to make up for some of the gaps that online-only classes will leave in their children's education. So rather than relying just on the online offerings that public schools have, they'll be having a teacher or a tutor come to their home and working with their kids and the children of their friends and neighbors to provide them a higher level of education and a much greater level of individualized attention. The cost for something like this can vary, but estimates are that each family puts in roughly $1,000 a month, and that allows the pod to hire a pretty accomplished instructor to come and work with the children. Now, here's where this gets tricky. Parents understandably want to make sure that their children don't fall too far behind. But the question is how this trend could deepen the educational divide along racial and class lines. According to a study from McKinsey, students will lose on the average 6 to 7 months of learning if in-class instruction doesn't resume again until next January, 6.8 months. But for African American students, that loss is going to be more than 10 months. For Hispanic American students, roughly 9.25 months. And for low-income students of all races, they're going to lose more than a year of education, 12.4 months, according to this McKinsey study. And so what that's going to do, of course, is create a much greater disparity when compared with students whose parents can afford the learning pod option. Now, look, I wish I knew the right answer on this one. This is a profoundly difficult question. Parents have provided private school options and tutors, even if they haven't called them pods, other types of learning support assistance for their children for decades, maybe centuries. But at a time when there's an increased focus on income inequality, it's very clear that the disparity can be greatly increased by unequal educational opportunities. Now, here in our house, our kids are grown, so we are spared this decision. But if our son and daughter were still in school, I don't know that I'd want to have to decide whether to sacrifice their education for the common good, or whether I'd want to give them the advantages I can afford, but at the expense of other school children. It's a very difficult question, and we'd be interested in your thoughts on this. So Claire, maybe we can put up question number 2 and see what our group thinks. Which option best reflects your feelings about students' education this fall? If you were in this situation, and some of you may be, for some of you it's hypothetical, would you, number 1, if in a position to do so financially, would you send your child to a private school or a tutor or a learning pod of the type that I described, despite the potential for increased educational inequality? Or would you alternatively keep your child in public school, even knowing that that child is not getting the same type of educational quality that you'd want her or want him to have under more normal circumstances? So let's see what the group thinks on this one. Wow, 88% say that you give your child those additional educational opportunities, like would be the natural instinct for most good parents and good grandparents. 12% say they'd keep the child in the public school despite lower education quality. But I think we'd all agree that neither of these is an ideal solution. And it's going to be one of the greatest challenges that we face as society, not just throughout the pandemic, but in its aftermath, when our school children return to their in-person classes with a much, much different type of educational experience during the time of the shutdown. So last, for today's news, I'd like to talk about Vice President Biden and his announcement next week of his running mate. You've all seen that he said that next week he will announce who he's going to name as his vice presidential nominee. And what's notable about this selection is not just that he's committed to picking a woman as his running mate. We've talked about this before. But this is only the 3rd time in American history that a major party nominee will have named a woman to his ticket. Now, in both of those other circumstances, in 1984, when Walter Mondale named Representative Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, and in 2008, when Senator John McCain named Governor Sarah Palin of Alaska to run on his ticket, both of those selections were seen as big gambles by the political community because at the time of those selections, both Mondale and McCain were running well behind in the polls. And the thought was they needed to take a big risk. They needed to do something to shake up the race. So I'd offer you this. Joe Biden's running mate, whoever she turns out to be, will be the first woman in our nation's history to be named to a major party ticket, not out of desperation, but rather as a sign of strength. And if you think about it, that in some ways is just as impressive and even more important to break through than either Ferraro or Palin's accomplishment. So our question for you, as I think you've probably already figured out, is who do you think Joe Biden will pick? Who will Biden select as his running mate? And we can't name all of them. We don't have room. So we've named a few, and I'll apologize for those of you who have another preference than the 4 who are listed here. But we've listed Senator Kamala Harris of here in California, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Representative Karen Bass, also California, from here in LA, and former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. And for those of you who prefer one of the other possibilities, Senator Duckworth from Illinois, Governor Lujan Grisham from New Mexico, Mayor Bottoms from Atlanta, any number of other candidates, I'll apologize, but you're just going to have to pick someone else. So given those 5 limited options, let's see what our group thinks. 40% say Senator Kamala Harris will be the running mate. 30% say Susan Rice. 14% say Representative Bass. 4% say Elizabeth Warren, very interesting. And finally, 13% say someone else. And maybe in our question and answer session, we can get a little bit more of a sense for who some of you might think that someone else should be. Now, what we were going to do in this section is, in addition to talking about female political leaders who would be on Vice President Biden's ticket for the general election, we were also going to talk for a little bit about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the controversy in which she was engaged last week. But I do want to get to questions, so I think we'll save the AOC conversation for next week or the week after. So before we go to your questions, I do want to ask your opinion of one more thing. Since we're talking about running mates, let's switch to the other side. Who will Donald Trump, do you think, select as his running mate for re-election? And this one's a lot easier. Do you think Trump will pick Mike Pence, his current vice president, to stay on the ticket? Or do you think he'll pick someone else? And of course, given Vice President Biden's commitment to picking a female running mate, it's worth noting that the Republican, about who is there's the most frequent speculation as a potential replacement to Pence, is of course former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina. So on this last question, let's see what all of you think about Donald Trump's running mate. 81% think that he's sticking with Mike Pence. 19%, just under 1/5, think we're going to go to someone else. So with that, we've covered 3 topics today out of hundreds, if not thousands, that are affecting our local and state and national and global politics. So Jessica, let's open up this conversation and let's see what our audience wants to talk about. Oh, Jessica, we're not hearing you. Or at least I'm not hearing you. Nope, no such luck. I'll tell you what, why don't you check on the computer, and what I'll do while you're trying to get this fixed is maybe I can go into a little bit more detail about some of the topics that we were talking about. I was a little bit surprised, I have to say, everyone, that more of you did not entertain the possibility of Trump replacing Mike Pence on his ticket. I don't know if he will or not, but I do suspect that there's going to be so much attention from the public and the news media when Biden names his running mate, that, as we all know, one of the things Donald Trump does not like to do at all is to cede the spotlight. And so I wonder if, again, not predicting that he will replace Pence, if he is going to look at that as a potential way of regaining the attention that he believes he deserves heading from the Democratic convention into his own. A couple months ago, we talked about this a little bit, and it's worth noting that when Trump named Mike Pence as his running mate back in 2016, one of the main reasons for it, one of the main reasons that that Pence was named, was his appeal with religious conservative voters, with evangelicals, with fundamentalists, and with other religious conservatives, because there was a widespread concern among Trump's advisors that Trump himself, by virtue of not just his political but his personal biography, might have a difficult time getting that key Republican voting bloc to support him. Well, over the course of 3.5 years, as you all know, Trump, through judicial nominations and a number of other steps that he has taken, has very much solidified and very much strengthened his hold on that group of voters, on religious conservatives. And so the president may decide, as many other nominees, as many other presidents have in the past when seeking re-election, that changing running mates would look like desperation, it might look like disarray, and so therefore he's better off staying with Pence, or he might decide that he likes having Mike Pence as vice president and wants to keep him on the ticket for that reason. But I can't help but to wonder whether it's Nikki Haley or someone else, if there isn't going to be at least some temptation on Donald Trump's part to think about a shift. What we know about the president, of course, what we know about Donald Trump, is that he believes, and he's written this, he wrote this in his own book, Art of the Deal, he believes that occupying as much of the public's and media's attention space is the key to success. And there have been extensive studies done that have showed that during both the Republican primary in 2016, but also during the general election campaign against Hillary Clinton, that Trump received a much, much larger amount of news coverage than the other candidates, both in the primary and against Clinton in the fall. There's an old saying that is attributed to the former basketball player, Dennis Rodman. And Dennis Rodman ostensibly once said he was being asked about something that he had done controversial, which there were many such things over the course of his career. Rodman was asked about the unfavorable attention and the unfavorable publicity that he was receiving. And Rodman said, "Hey, the only bad press is an obituary. The only bad press is an obituary." Now, whether Rodman said that or not, it's clearly something that Donald Trump believes, and in fact has written and said on his own behalf, not quite in such stark language, but has made it clear that he would rather be occupying public and media attention, even in an unfavorable and unflattering way, rather than ceding that stage to someone else. And what Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and others realized 4 years ago is even if what Trump was saying was unpopular or controversial or maybe not helpful to him in other ways, it was still keeping them from getting their messages heard. And one of the things we've seen over 3.5 plus years of the Trump presidency is his focus on maintaining that level of public and media attention. Number one, in order to keep his opponents from being heard the way they might like to, but also so that when he does say or do something controversial, it allows him to shift the public conversation away from something else that might be causing him damage. Now today, as I think most of you know, hey Jessica, you're back. Let's see if we
can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Great. All right.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Do you want to continue your thought and then I'll jump in?
What I was just about to do, and hopefully someone will have a question about it, is I was going to bring up the president's tweet this morning about delaying the election, even though it's been dismissed by leaders of both parties. I'm going to guess you got at least one question on that topic.
I think we have about 6.
Okay, well, let's start with one and see how it goes.
Okay, great. Well, that's exactly the first question. Is there any traction to Trump tweeting this morning about delaying the election? So that's kind of summarizing what 6 people have asked, and maybe you can share your thoughts.
And the answer is it does not appear that there's any traction to it at all. Not only has the suggestion been denounced by Democratic leaders, but by Republicans as well. Senator McConnell, Representative McCarthy, Senator Marco Rubio, and others have all said, as have many other Republicans, that this is not something appropriate. And it's worth going back to a conversation that we may have had in our very first or second webinar way back in late March, early April. As we talked then, as some of you with long memories might recall, we talked then about what the authority is to make such decisions. And as you may remember, the president cannot move a general election day. That's something that's set in law, it's set in statute, and it would have to be done by an act of Congress. I think even if Congress were to break down along party lines on this, which it does not appear that it would, given McCarthy and McConnell's and Rubio's and others' statements on this, I think it's very, very unlikely that a Democratic House of Representatives would move in such a direction. So what is Trump doing if he knows that something like this really can't be accomplished? Well, as we've talked about before, Trump has spoken out in increasingly harsh language about mail voting, and in particular what he believes is an enhanced possibility for voter fraud when voting is conducted by mail. And a lot of people suspect, myself included, that the president is laying the groundwork so that if he is not reelected in November, he'll be able to point to the election fraud that he would argue existed because of the mail voting, and therefore try to contest the election. So we don't know, and we've talked about this a number of times on this webinar before, we don't know how President Trump would react if the election did not turn out in his favor, come November, come December, come January. But it looks like at least this morning's tweet on his part was roundly rejected by leaders of both parties. And my guess, at least, is it had less to do with actually moving the election date than just continuing, as Trump has been doing for some time, to get the voters to begin worrying about voter fraud by mail as much as he's been worrying about it.
Yeah, I did see on C-SPAN House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy saying, like, that's not an option. And of course, we'll be hosting him in a couple of weeks, so we can always grill him on that a bit more.
Perfect.
But yes, to your point, a lot of people are asking, will Trump accept the outcome of the election, and will he have to be dragged out of the White House? I feel like if he loses, he'll probably just head straight to Trump Tower and bail on all of this. But what are your thoughts?
Well, as we've talked about before, many times, Jessica, I really don't like making predictions. But as much as I don't like making predictions about other things, I'm really not very good at making predictions about Donald Trump. I don't know how he'll react to this. I think the one thing, whether you are a supporter or an opponent of the president's, I think I would hope you would join me in rooting for a decisive outcome one way or another, because a very close election and the confusion and the animosity that caused 20 years ago in the year 2000, I think would be much, much greater in this political landscape. We know that the increased mail voting, for all the benefits it brings, also has the potential to delay results in many swing states. And one of the things that hopefully news media and political leaders of both parties will begin doing in short order is begin laying the groundwork, reminding and reiterating to voters that this year we might not have an election night, that in fact it might be an election week or longer as results come in. And so to your point, Jessica, is in a close election, the temptation of the president resisting is a lot greater. Biden himself has let it know, as has Speaker Pelosi, that if Biden is elected and Trump will simply refuses to leave the White House in January, that they believe that there are grounds to have him removed. But as Biden pointed out, and I think this is the best way of looking at it, which is the presidency is not a location. It's a constitutionally vested office. And if it were to come to that, and I hope you're right, Jessica, that it won't, the fact that an individual is occupying some space on Pennsylvania Avenue does not in any way affect the constitutional transfer of power. We've talked about this before as well. When Richard Nixon was resisting resignation, calls for his resignation back in 1974 at the height of Watergate, a small number of Republican congressional leaders, Barry Goldwater of Arizona, Jim Rhodes of Ohio, and a couple of others went to the White House and told him, said, Mr. President, it's time for you to go. And Nixon, who was a product of partisan politics and of his party, took that seriously. I don't think if it came to a moment like this that Donald Trump would be as willing to listen to Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy as Nixon was to his party's leaders back in the day. But I do believe that some of the nation's business leaders, some of Wall Street's leading figures, people who Trump respects in a business but not in a political context, I suspect people like that could go to him and say, Mr. President, you don't want to be remembered as the only president who refused to leave the White House. And I wonder if it did come to that, and I hope it won't, if non-political but business and finance figures who he does hold in high regard might be willing to deliver that message the same way Goldwater and the others did to Nixon back in the 1970s.
Thank you. In case the election isn't certified by Congress before noon on January 20th, what happens? By the 20th Amendment, Trump and Pence's term ends then. Does the Speaker of the new House become president?
Well, this gets really tricky, and there are a number of arguments on this. The one that I've heard that makes the most sense, as the questioner suggests, is if the election isn't settled, if it's still being contested in some way on January 20th, Donald Trump and Mike Pence no longer hold their office as a president and vice president. But there's also a question that if the election has not been certified, that means that Nancy Pelosi is not being reelected to the House of Representatives either. So what some constitutional scholars argue would happen at that point is that because the election is not certified, we do not have a president-elect, we do not have members of the House of Representatives who took office on January 3rd. What you have is a Senate. Now, 1/3 of the Senate would no longer be in office because they will have held elections for their seats in November. So what you would have is you would have 2/3 of the United States Senate the members who were elected in 2018 and 2016, who are in the middle of their terms in 2020, they would be the legislative branch of government. And in the presidential succession, as many of you know, after the president and the vice president, and after the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the next individual in the presidential succession is the president pro tem of the Senate. And the president pro tem is not the majority leader or the minority leader. It's simply the member who has served in the Senate for the longest period of time from the majority party. Now, this is where it gets really tricky. The member of the Senate who's been in office the longest is Republican Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa. And so he would then be the leader of the Republican Party in terms of seniority. But if you eliminate the 33 current senators who are up for re-election or whose seats are up for re-election this November, of the remaining 67 senators, Jessica, the remaining majority is actually Democratic. And so the most likely answer to the questioners to the question is Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who is the longest serving Democrat in the United States Senate, would in all likelihood become president of the United States on January 20th, because there would have neither been a presidential election or congressional elections that have been settled. Now, that took a while, and it'll take the courts even longer to weed through it. But of the various arguments I've heard, that's the most credible one. So for those of you in the room who are fans of Patrick Leahy, that's where you should be rooting.
Thank you. This questioner asks, I would be remiss if I did not ask your thoughts on the memorial service for John Lewis happening as we meet.
John Lewis is an American hero, and the best description of his life I read from someone who referred to him as a war hero, a veteran, and just pointing out that just because he fought his battle on the Edmund Pettus Bridge rather than at Normandy or in another more conventional military setting, that he deserves the same regard and respect as anyone who sacrificed themselves for their country. Now, he happily did not perish on that bridge, and I think stirringly, he was given I think a wonderful tribute when he was able to cross that bridge a few days ago, with the state troopers saluting him in his memory. So I think as we struggle with such a difficult challenge of race relations and discussions on how people from different communities and different backgrounds and different identities can work together and live together in this society, I think Lewis is passing, and I don't say this in a partisan sense on either side. So I think people who get frustrated by these types of challenges, these kind of divisions, can look at someone like Lewis as evidence that if you stand strong and if you stand up on behalf of principles that you believe in, even if it seems insurmountable, that you can accomplish these goals. Lewis, yeah, I'm sensitive that I'm probably not the ideal person to talk about his legacy, and there have been many beautiful tributes that have been offered in his memory. And so I think rather than me talking any more about him, I'd simply encourage everyone who's watching and who cares, and I hope you do, to seek out those tributes who are better positioned to offer them than I am.
Thank you. Dan, you say partisanship has precluded Washington from addressing the pandemic, but you are simply addressing this supplemental bill. Hasn't the real partisanship been the Trump administration's failure to address from the federal platform a national program of mask, shutdown, testing, and tracing, and PPE measures?
Well, I was talking today specifically about the legislative package, if only because the unemployment benefits are such a critical issue. And there are other congressional remedies that are necessary, that are being debated and are yet still unresolved. But I wouldn't pretend for a moment that passing a bill in Congress is the only obstacle to this country more successfully confronting the challenge that the pandemic has presented to us. It's notable that compared to other industrialized societies around the world, how much our country has struggled, how much of a difficult time we have had taking on this menace in a realistic and a mature way. A large portion of that blame falls at the feet of our leaders. As I've talked about on the show before, I think a large amount of that blame falls at the feet of the citizens of this country who choose not to wear masks or abide in social distancing. But I have no doubt, and I agree with the questioner's premise in this regard, that more forceful leadership and stronger examples from our nation's leaders would have put a lot more societal expectations and pressures on individuals to behave in a more responsible way. I saw a terrific interview yesterday with a professor at Harvard talking about this. And he made it clear that he was very much an opponent of Trump's before the pandemic, and talked about how disappointed he was by the way the president and the administration had handled this challenge. But what he also said, and I thought this was great advice, is he said, right now as a country, we need to spend less time thinking about the 150,000 people we've lost and more time thinking about the next 150,000 people. So I do agree with the premise of the questioner's of the questioner's point, but I also think that even in the absence of that leadership, it's the responsibility of all of us to behave in an appropriate way, in which, according to public opinion polls, we're still not doing. The percentages of those wearing masks and engaging in social distancing who have the luxury of being able to do so is much lower than it ought to be. And as I said earlier, a lot of that is the responsibility of our nation's leader. A lot of that is the responsibility of the rest of us too.
Thank you. What is your reaction to LA City Council member Paul Koretz's proposal to fine those who fail to wear masks in public?
I support it. Los Angeles, there are any number of cities in the Los Angeles area that are fining individuals for not wearing masks or otherwise engaging in inappropriate social distancing measures. And I respect the way Mayor Garcetti and Governor Newsom and other elected officials in both parties have talked about this. They've said this isn't about punishing people, it's about educating them. Well, we are 4.5 months in now. And I figure if someone after 4.5 months is still not educated as to the importance of wearing a mask, of engaging in social distancing, a fine, not imprisonment, but I think a monetary fine is an appropriate deterrent to encourage more people to act responsibly. If the only downside to not wearing a mask is if you get caught, you get a lecture, I'm not sure that provides a lot of, I'm not sure that it provides a great push forward. And so I do think that Koretz's proposal is a legitimate one. And I'd like to see Los Angeles and other cities realize that while education is an important, maybe even the most important part of this challenge, that ultimately we do at some point have to think about penalizing those who simply refuse to abide by local or state or federal regulations.
Thank you. How can this country go forward without relief to the state and local governments? And then somebody also asked, with all the COVID aid proposed, will it increase the budget deficit of the country? Isn't there any concern at all?
Okay. So the first part of the question, as it relates to aid to local and state governments, is the federal government, of course, can run a deficit. A state or local government, at least technically, cannot. Although, as we're seeing out of Sacramento over the last several days, the legislature there has been looking at a very number of creative ways of engaging in deficit finance and in deficit funding in order to finance a relief package. Once again, this is a difference between the Democratic and the Republican proposals. The Democrats are proposing roughly $1 trillion out of their $3 trillion package for direct relief for state and local governments. What the Republicans are saying instead is for state and local governments to be able to use the money that they've already been given with more flexibility and fewer strings attached from the federal government. And so while overall the amount of money in the Democratic proposal is much larger than in the Republican proposal, the Republicans who generally tend, not always, but tend to lean on the side of moving responsibility from Washington to state and local governments are saying instead of more money, let's give the locals more flexibility to spend what they have. My guess is that because there are a lot of red states in the country who are having budget problems just as severe as in blue states, that there's an awful lot of Republican House members and senators from those red states who are hearing it from the local and state officials who they represent. And so my guess is that when there is a package, when there's a final COVID-19 relief package, you'll see an amount for local and state government that's much larger, much closer to the Democratic number than the Republican number, not because the Republicans are giving in to the Democrats, but because the Republican constituencies are going to be putting that pressure on them.
Someone asks, it took a war to recover from the Great Depression. How long might it take the US to recover from this depression?
I don't know, and I don't know anyone who does know. It seems it doesn't seem that long ago, because it wasn't, when a lot of very smart people were talking about a so-called V-shaped recovery, the idea that we bottom out very quickly and then recover equally quickly. And it's pretty clear, both because of a lack of leadership and a lack of followership, that our unwillingness to stay locked down as long as we needed to has precluded the likelihood of any kind of short-term recovery. Most of the economists who I respect are now saying it will be sometime in mid or late 2021 before we see a significant recovery. And that, of course, doesn't mean coming all the way back to where we were at the beginning of 2020. It means just sustained and continued economic growth. A lot of people who study these things more closely than me think it will be several years before our economy regains its pre-pandemic health. And while hopefully it won't take military action in order to fire up the economic engines the way World War II did for a post-depression America, I think more and more, even otherwise optimistic people, are realizing that even when there is a vaccine, it's not foolproof, and that there will be, many generations of vaccines that will be necessary before the pandemic can be completely controlled. So I hope I'm wrong on this, but the people who I read and who I respect the most are saying that while we'll begin seeing some recovery, maybe late this year, probably next year, the return to the types of economic strength we'd experienced recently is now many years away.
What is the difference between absentee voting and mail voting?
None. There's no difference.
All right, I'll move on to the next one. I checked online to see.
To the question, I don't want to dismiss the questioner. President Trump has distinguished from his decision to vote absentee with broader mail voting, and the implication is that an absentee vote is one that should be cast only when there's no other option. That if the voter, her or himself, simply cannot cast the ballot in person, and that voting by mail is something that's much more optional. Now, there's another conversation we had about the benefits or the potential downsides of making voting more convenient. But the distinction Trump draws is between a voter who has no other option than to vote remotely and one who simply chooses to out of ease or convenience. But it is worth noting, as we've talked about on this webinar before, that large numbers of Republican Party leaders, both elected and state party officials, are pushing very hard for expanded mail voting in their states this fall, and are beginning to let it be known to the news media in their states that they would prefer it if the president were not talking down mail voting the way he has, because their worry is that Republicans who are loyal to the president will hear Trump disparaging mail voting and that they simply won't vote. And we're already seeing in a couple of primary states where Republican turnout is noticeably down. And the supposition is that the reason for that is that a lot of faithful Republican Party voters are hearing the president warn about the dangers of mail voting and are just sitting out altogether. And for state officials, that's something of great concern.
Interesting. All right, I wanted to move on to the education portion. I know we took a lot on that, but there was a ton of questions on the upcoming election. This person says, I checked online to see that learning pods are very expensive, in the thousands of dollars. How are poorer communities going to participate?
Well, it's the exact right question to ask, and the answer is, in all likelihood, they're not. The analysis I read suggested $1,000 per month per family in order to put together some type of group pod learning experience. And obviously, there's a lot of range, both upward and lower than that, depending on the extent of and the quality of the education available to the children. But the truth is, a family from more challenging socioeconomic circumstances simply can't afford that. And that means that they will be relying entirely on the distance learning provided by their local public schools. And as I talked about earlier, that's going to exacerbate and intensify the learning gap that we already see between young people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's going to create even a greater level of inequity when school children do return to in-person classes, whenever that might be. There are some school districts in the state and in the country that are talking about offering these types of pods themselves as part of public school offerings for children from more at-risk circumstances. But the money just simply doesn't exist to provide that kind of experience for every school child. So the questioner's concern is, I think, very well placed. You certainly can't, nor should you, forbid a parent from doing everything they can to enhance their child's learning prospects. But I think it is important for us to remember that we are intensifying educational inequity, which ultimately is going to lead to even greater economic inequity.
Thank you. Why are unions fighting so hard to stay home to teach? Do you think parents will support teachers' unions when their agenda includes defunding police, non-teaching related terms?
Well, most of the teachers' unions I've seen that are arguing most strongly against in-person education are doing so because they simply don't believe it will be safe, either for the children or for the teachers. And it's, to a large degree, the way this debate plays out is going to depend on the broader political landscape in the state in question. So, for example, here in California, we have in the LA area, we have local and state government that are very supportive and in very close political alliances with the organized labor, particularly teachers unions. So while there'll be some criticism and some back and forth about how the fall semester is implemented, I think ultimately it's going to be more bickering than anything serious. In red states, in states like Texas and states like Arizona, where Republican and conservative local and state government have this authority, their relationships with the teachers union in their states are much more combative and much more confrontational. And we're already seeing threats of teachers' strikes in these red states. Those teachers are suggesting that they will simply refuse. If they are ordered back in the school, they'll simply refuse to show up. I differ with the teachers unions personally on a number of issues and on charter schools and other types of school reforms, but I do understand their concerns about safety of their members. And I do think, as we've watched, if we've watched the very difficult situation in which Major League Baseball has found itself over the last several days, the Florida Marlins team, as I think many of you know, had roughly half of their roster test positive for the virus. And a logical argument to make is, if a professional sports league with all the resources and all the experts and all the advice in the world is still not able to protect its participants, maybe we're not ready to offer the kind of protection necessary to students and teachers in public schools. But the answer to the question is, it really depends on the elected officials in a school district or a city or a state. In a state like California, there'll be disagreements, but resolvable. But where there's a stronger conservative presence among elected officials, I think you're going to see real acrimony and, in all likelihood, work stoppages, which is not going to be good for anyone, most notably for the school children themselves.
So 56 minutes in, and we got our first baseball reference. I was expecting one sooner. Okay, so I want to get a little bit into the VP questions. Would Tammy Duckworth be eligible to run for president? Her mom was a Thai citizen and she was born in Thailand. Her dad was an American citizen.
Okay. I believe that Senator Duckworth would be eligible to run for president. I'm not certain of the specifics of her parents' citizenry and heritage, but my understanding is that she would be eligible to run, and I apologize that I don't have more specific information on that.
Thank you. What is Mike Pence's value added when Trump is trailing in the polls? Do you think he will throw Pence under the bus?
As I suggested earlier, I think the possibility certainly exists, and the temptation for Trump would certainly exist to replace Trump on the ticket, not because of any dissatisfaction toward Pence on Trump's part, but simply as a way of shaking up the race and of bringing attention back from Biden and his running mate to Trump and his new vice presidential nominee. As I've said many times, I'll never predict what Donald Trump is going to do or not going to do. I'll simply state that I see a very obvious temptation on Trump's part, knowing that he no longer needs Pence to secure the support of religious conservative voters, to consider an alternative that might excite his supporters and might draw him attention at a critical point in the campaign.
Thank you. Will the evangelicals feel abandoned by Trump if he dumps Pence?
4 years ago, that would have been a problem. But I suspect, and I haven't seen polling on this, so it really is just a guess on my part, is that Trump has demonstrated the religious conservative community over the last 3+ years, fundamentalist evangelicals and other religious conservatives, that he is someone on whom they can rely to move forward on the most important aspects of their agenda. And while there's some disappointment on their part about the way that Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch have voted in recent cases of import to these voters, I think Trump and his advisors believe that if anything, this heightens or this strengthens his argument for socially conservative voters as to the importance of judicial nominees. So I think there'd be some disappointment, but I don't know that it would cost Trump a great deal of support.
All right, and this is probably our last question. What might happen if Justice Ginsburg cannot continue in her role on the Supreme Court?
Well, as most of you know, Justice Ginsburg was hospitalized again last night, although her spokesperson made it clear that it was not something of great seriousness and that she expected to be out again within a matter of days. The question, it's a little bit awkward because the last thing I want to do is talk morbidly about a human being's passing. But Justice Ginsburg is the oldest member of the court and has had some health issues. The question is how quickly could or would the United States Senate confirm a new justice? And my guess is, based on Senator McConnell's actions and statements in the past, is that they could move pretty quickly. So there's probably a point, say in October, in which it would probably be too late to confirm a new justice before the election. But I would bet you that if Justice Ginsburg or another justice appointed by a Democratic president were to pass or otherwise leave the court, that the White House and the Republican Senate leadership would break all records for the fastest confirmation of a new justice in order to have it accomplished before Election Day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're right at 12 o'clock. So Kim, I will turn the conversation back over to you.
Jessica, thank you so much. And thanks for managing our technical issues. You're great under fire and under pressure. Dan,
Sure.
what an enlightening discussion. Just the question that amazed me the most is if the election isn't certified in January, who's going to be president? I'm so impressed that you knew all of the ramifications of that. That is something to think about.
Well, hopefully something that we'll never actually ever have to rely on.
Hopefully, we'll see. We can't wait for next week, Dan.
I'm
Thank
looking
you
forward
so
to it
very
too.
much.
Thank you so much.
For our viewers, if you've enjoyed this fabulous program today, here's how you can pledge your support. And we do this because of Dan. Please type the word Schnur, S-C-H-N-U-R, into the number that you see on the screen. That's S-C-H-N-U-R. And try to help us out because we're giving all of these great webinars for free and we need your support. So please give today. We have a terrific lineup for you next week. In addition to Dan's program next Thursday, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, on August 4th, we have Business Ethics, New Rules of Engagement with Rob Chestnut, who's the Chief Ethics Officer at Airbnb. On August 11th, we have Creating the World You Want to Live In with LMU President Tim Snyder and some of his key faculty members who will be discussing the future of higher education. And then, as Dan mentioned, on August 19th, we have a conversation with House Republican leader, Congressman Kevin McCarthy. So please go to our website at lawac.org, register for our programs next week and upcoming programs, and we'll see you soon, hopefully next week. Dan, thank you again so very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.